I spent my whole childhood right in front of the cemetery. I lived in a private house, and this very cemetery was always perfectly visible if you looked out the window. The first screenshot is of the place where I lived. The highlighted gray area is the necropolis. To my memory, no burial occurred there for quite a while, no guards, and no fence either, or rather, it is present, but in an extremely dilapidated state. There are a number of old crypts, as well as a chapel, which is rarely occupied, although, it is periodically renovated and painted a shiny blue paint. As I said before, I spent my entire childhood there, living in a private village house, and I had no choice where to walk outside, because the only area free of the same village houses was the cemetery itself. I used to run there every day, and with the neighbor children we used to play hide and seek right in the middle of the crosses and monuments. The game was pretty hardcore. There are plenty of secluded places to hide there. It was there that I first kissed a girl, first smoked a cigarette, first did all the other things teenagers do. I think I've summarized the place enough, so we can move on to the stories I have. If you think living across the street from such a place meant I was free of all sorts of cemetery prejudices and fears, you'd be wrong. I think we had a lot more of them than all the other kids. In our fantasies, there was a whole universe of all sorts of evil things there. You could write a whole guidebook on this shit. For example, there were mermaids from the nearest river who crawled to the graves, devils, who were later reclassified as demons, a couple of fucked up witches, underground nothings from dens, and ghouls. Ghouls, incidentally, of several types, some shambling out at night, others residing in remote crypts, and then there were the runners. The running ghouls are a special topic of conversation, since none of us doubted that they certainly existed. That's because at dusk, there really was someone running through the cemetery. I had several encounters with these runners. The first encounter was when I was 7 or 8 years old. The three of us were out for a walk on an August evening and decided to climb a tree. It was a difficult task, but we managed to do it. The tree was huge and sprawling, and it was pretty awesome to sit there. Each of the guys took a branch. We were amazed at our courage when we looked down. None of us were too keen on going down, everyone was waiting for someone to be the first to go down. Twilight came, it was getting darker and it was time to go home. We were arguing with each other who would not mind just jumping down when we heard some noise. Someone was running towards the river about 10 meters from our tree. There were no paths, just piles of dry leaves rustling loudly under the feet of the mysterious runner. We fell silent and listened. We didn't want to be seen in such a vulnerable position in front of a stranger. The leaves were already yellowing, but still fully retained their thickness, preventing us from seeing anything below. 5 minutes had passed. My friend, the Uruk, said,
"All right, let's go home already,"
and begun climbing down from the branch. Suddenly, running again, also towards the river. Now the sound of rustling leaves was no longer on our left, but on our right. My friend froze in a position where he had one leg down and looked at us with his eyes darting. I don't know why, but we gestured for him to come back up quickly. He got back to his previous position and we heard someone heavy and obviously bipedal dash past again. Why am I sure of the bipedal nature of this creature? I do not know. We often met dogs in the cemetery and their light, gentle trotting was quite unlike the heavy and noisy running we had to hear that evening. It ended rather amusingly. After the third appearance of the unknown runner, my other friend, nicknamed Kloppen, and also the proud owner of a cell phone, took out his phone and began to call my mother. After about 10 minutes we heard our names being shouted. Then they called my father with a ladder, and I still to this day, at any opportunity, recall the story of how, supposedly, as a child I climbed a tree and sat there until night because I could not get down. Although in reality I could. The story about someone running around us was always seen as my ridiculous childhood excuse for this stupidity. The second time happened a couple of years later. On a dark winter evening, Kloppen, the hero of the previous story, and I were sitting on the corner on one of the benches near an old grave, arguing animatedly about something. I don't remember what my argument was, but Kloppen firmly refused to accept it and shoved me. I could barely keep myself in that uncomfortable position, and immediately and decisively fought back by pushing Kloppen back. He rolled over on his back and began to fall, shouting, I laughed heartily, and so did Kloppen. Suddenly there was a sharp crunch of snow behind me. We stopped talking and stared over there. Someone was running away from the nearest bushes. We rushed to see who it was, but we couldn't see anything. The sound of running through the drifts was heard for another minute, moving away from us at a decent pace. To make a long story short, while we were sitting on the bench, someone was in the nearby bushes and then ran out of there abruptly. Were there footprints there? Yes, there were. They looked like any other trail at this time of year, just pits in the snow. From then on, the myths about graveyard ghouls were born, with new details added in our retelling to the rest of our friends, about a black silhouette, red eyes of staggering speed. Next came the canonical version: the ghoul could not get close to us because there was a cross next to us. The third incident occurred in the fall. This time I was alone. More precisely, I was waiting for Kloppen, who was about to return with homemade munchies in the form of pierogi or balayash. I was bored and practiced throwing knives at trees. A sound came to my ears, as if someone was sneaking hastily through the brush towards me. I interpreted the noise as Kloppen returning with some goodies, and went to the source of the sound. And found nothing there. I called out a couple of times to be sure, but was answered with silence. It got creepy. And then I really scared Kloppen. He came back with a bag of balayash and found me sitting in the bushes with 2 knives at the ready. The fourth incident came at a fully conscious age. It wasn't exactly an encounter. I was sitting up at night, studying for exams. My mother had already gone to bed, so I snuck out of the house, got a stash of Blue Moro and a lighter from under the window. I lit a cigarette and sat down by the gate. Rare cars drove by the house, and there were crosses right in front of it. I took a drag and saw someone running parallel to the hedge. Running with all his might, fast, waving his arms heartily. There was no path there. Branches, potholes, mounds and fallen off iron beams were everywhere. If you don't look where you're going, you could easily hit your head on some crypt or monument. He doesn't care though. He's running there in the dark, easy as if he was on a soccer field. He even seems to be jumping over something. I couldn't see his face or his head. And the clothes? Ordinary clothes, ordinary jacket, ordinary pants, all gray, for it was barely illuminated by a distant lantern. Unfortunately, that is all the description I can give. I was reminded of all the children's stories about nothing in our cemetery, so I quickly finished my cigarette and went home. Next up is the story of the vibrating crosses, and in fact the name fully describes the essence of the phenomenon. Although this might not be exactly the case, there are not many iron crosses per se. Crosses are mostly stone, but fences, benches and some old monuments are iron. They vibrate. It happens quite rarely and imperceptibly. We discovered this feature when we put all sorts of stuff on one of the iron tables so that they would not fall out of pockets during our games. One of the items was a cell phone. We were playing some kind of hide and seek when I heard the vibrations and ran to get the phone. To my surprise, the phone didn't have any missed calls. I shrugged and put the phone back down. It vibrated again, now sounding more suspicious. I put my hand to the table and felt it. I called the guys over and showed them the new gimmick. All touched and were equally as surprised. One of the guys put their keys and there was a nasty sound of metal rattling against metal. But not for long, it soon stopped. We had a little concilium, during which we divided into 2 groups. One of them, including me, assumed the paranormal origin of the vibration, and the other concluded that it was just a passing car. You can notice in the pictures that there is a road right next to the cemetery. During the experiment, the keys and phone were put back on the table. The next car did not take long to drive by and marked the victory of the paranormal group. No vibration had occurred. On the second car, the case was not any different. There was no more of it at all on that day or on any of the following days. I encountered this thing again many years later. At that time I was making love to a girl. We met in a text chat room, remember those at the bottom of regional TV channels, and was for her an incredibly brave and mysterious hero, because I could take her for a walk in the cemetery. This won women's hearts like nothing else, for in those years there was a special demand for vampires, Twilight, Gothic, and other dark stuff. We were walking in the most decent and well-trodden part of the cemetery, the sun was setting, and I suggested we take a seat on one of the benches.
Right here?
My companion said like a frightened little bird. What's the big deal? You should be afraid of the living, not the dead, I smiled enigmatically. So I fell with her on the bench. I embraced her gallantly by the waist and began to show her some pictures on my phone. And suddenly there it was, vibrations, under our asses, as if sitting on a washing machine. It went on for a few seconds. The girl shrieked and jumped up. I got up as well. What's that? She asked dumbfoundedly. I assured her, not wanting to frighten an already nervous person, suggesting we go further away. A chill ran down my spine. There are 3 burrows in total. Technically, they are more holes than burrows. Or not. I'm not sure. They are 3 big vertical holes in the ground. They're about half the diameter of the standard sewer manholes. All 3 are in the far corners of the cemetery. 2 of the holes aren't too far apart, about 20 meters, and the third is in a completely different part of the cemetery. I marked their approximate locations on the screenshot. Maybe there are others. These things are pretty inconspicuous and it's strange that no one has accidentally fallen into them. The clue must be that we locals knew their location, and outsiders rarely went into such wilds of the cemetery. However, they are not big enough even to where a child could fall into them completely. There are a lot of strange things associated with these burrows. To begin with, they are very deep. A flashlight does not shine down to the bottom, and things thrown down disappear forever. Another peculiarity, however, to explain it, the holes were unchanged. I discovered them when I was still in junior high school. Years passed, I went from class to class, and the holes were still in place. They never changed in size, their edges never overgrown with weeds. After all, tons of leaves must have fallen into the pits over all the time, but the depth of the pits was never affected. It was always cold near the pits. There was never a breeze or draft coming from there, but if you got a meter or half closer, you could feel the air around you getting cooler. Surprisingly, in winter everything was exactly the opposite. The snow on the edges of the pits lay only in the heaviest snowfalls and frosts, and during normal times it quickly melted and the locations of the pits were easily noticeable by black circles of soil. And worst of all, sometimes these pits hummed. Sometimes, at night, one could hear a very, very low sound coming from there, similar to the monotonous hum of many wind instruments. It didn't happen every time, but I heard it enough times to be able to distinguish it from the normal sounds of the city. We recorded this hum on dictaphones, but the recording was barely any different from the usual background noise. The sound is probably there during the day, but you can only hear it clearly in the silence of the night. Our cemetery has always attracted all kinds of goth Satanists, some of whom have even become my friends. For example, I had my first taste of hard liquor with a female Satanist I met there by chance. Most of them are actually normal guys for whom the Necropolis was just an ideal place to hang out in their company. Then there were some really fucked up people though, who did rituals and drew pentagrams, defiled the graves, really fucked up stuff if you ask me. I've often seen crookedly drawn symbols, candle remnants, and other bullshit. I googled it a little, and there are still some people who go there. I've attached pictures from a news site. What made these truther Satanists different was that they were extremely aggressive and rude to anyone who wanted to go with them when they did their rituals. The local group consisted of a frail guy with a book and 5 or 6 girls whom he showed how to place the attributes and draw all kinds of crayons. One day the girls even undressed and began to lead a round dance. I know this because my friend Kloppen and I used to sneak out of the house at night and peek behind them, hoping to see a real orgy. Alas, no, we never did. But that's not the story I want to tell. The fact is that in the cemetery there are really strange people. For example, smilers, as I nicknamed them myself. Sometimes, on a certain day, neatly dressed smiling men with flowers start walking along the paths among the graves. They come in during the day, put flowers at a random grave, a different one each time, they don't even look at it properly, and then spend the rest of the day wandering around the grounds with happy facial expressions. I don't know how to describe it in more detail. They're not happy or kind, they don't look like they're stoned. It's like it's hard for them to hold back a smile and a good mood. Sometimes one of them would sit down on a bench and lean back and start looking into the distance with a mesmerized face. He would stretch out his hand in front of him and begin to recite a poem about the beauty of nature. Sometimes they would meet each other, and begin to smile even more strongly, one might even say, more happily. If you don't look closely, just people who decided to spend a warm summer day in the park. And I looked at them closely when I realized that they were all leaving together at a certain time. Just once, sitting with a cigarette late in the evening, I noticed that next to me, one of the smiling men, went towards the exit. And then another one. And another. There were 4 of them in all. I looked at my watch, and it read 15 minutes to 12. These smiling gentlemen come to the cemetery several times a year, in summer or in the warm autumn. They always behave the same way. I'm not creeped out by the fact that these schizos walk there, but I am creeped out by the thought of where they come from and where they go afterwards. We have our own sorcerer, too. Not everyone has seen him, but everyone can easily describe his appearance. A crumpled, skinny old man with a goatee. Always angry, with a stick in his hand. He could hit somebody with that stick if you got too close to him. He is said to have hated children in particular, and he was said to have actually hit a junior high school boy, who stumbled across his feet. Why is he a sorcerer? Most likely he was so nicknamed because of his characteristic appearance resembling Kache. Did I happen to see this grandfather with my own eyes? Yes, it happened and I want to tell about it in detail. In addition to his bad temper, the wizard was rumored to have one more unpleasant characteristic. If he saw some sweets near the graves, he would not hesitate to climb over the fence. Pick them up and eat them immediately. Although the cemetery has long been abandoned to the burial, some old people still visit their relatives and often leave them different tidbits. I kind of had to see this for myself. One day on my way back from school I saw this legendary grandfather, and I immediately had a burning desire to see how he was eating candy. Cautiously, without giving away his presence, I walked a few dozen meters behind him and watched. He was moving very, very slowly, and was fastidiously looking at the graves. 20 minutes had passed and I was about to give up and go home, but then I look, and the old man had stopped at some fence, bent over and picked something up and started eating it. As far as I could tell from the back. And then he walked much faster, without looking anywhere, right up to the gate. I immediately rushed back. I wanted to take a candy wrapper as proof of the legend. Frankly speaking, I do not know how it can serve as proof, but at that moment I did not think about it. I ran to the grave and began to look around. No wrappers. I look at the grave at which he was, and there is a trace of his palm on the ground, as if scooped. It looked like Grandpa was enjoying chewing on some cemetery dirt as opposed to any sweets. I will continue the theme of interesting personalities in the cemetery. In addition to the smiling people and the candy-eating grandfather described earlier, we actually have, or at least had, a real witch. She lives somewhere in town and has a reputation as either a psychic or a fortune teller. It was in the internet-free beginning of the 90s and somehow, most likely by word of mouth, she attracted a lot of people. The essence of her magical practices was that she would gather a few of her clients, give them a rope, take the end of it, and lead such a zoo around a cemetery chanting some prayers. It always looked very extravagant and attracted an audience of onlookers, including, of course, our band of local boys. This witch was always dressed like a magpie, dressed in scarves, long skirts, and strings of colorful beads. She was a kind of orthodox, light witch, and at the end of the show she handed out church candles to the participants, those who walked by the rope, and then proceeded to light them. It was all funny, of course, but she also went there at night. Or rather, she came at least once. Not by the main road, but by a small path. I was just hanging out near one of the paths, and we spotted the witch. This time she, dressed in irregular jeans, climbed through a wide gap in the fence. And the witch was not alone, she was dragging some middle-aged man by the hand. The man looked very frightened, just trembling with fear. When the witch saw us, she yelled at us.
"Get out of here, kids."
We got scared and ran out of there at a brisk pace. Out of the corner of my eye I noticed that the man seemed to struggle, trying to free his hand, but the witch would not let go and pulled him harder instead. That was the story. As I told you above, there is a small chapel in the cemetery. I attached a picture. There are a couple of stories connected to it. Honestly, I don't know if people live there at night. Usually it looks empty and people rarely enter or leave it. Either way we try not to get too close. Although the building itself looks nice, that impression immediately disappears after sunset. Once night falls on the cemetery, the vicinity of the chapel becomes one of the creepiest places. I'm not sure why, but it seems as if the church is surrounded by gusts of cold wind, the air there always in slight motion. Even in the calmest weather, it sometimes feels like you're standing somewhere drafty. Sometimes, there is a light on in one of the side rooms, but we didn't see anyone flicker in the window even once. Next to the building itself are a couple of ancient-looking lanterns. These lanterns are, how should I say, strange. Not always, but at some points they begin to shine very, very dimly. There are several lanterns exactly like these along the walking part of the cemetery, and they shine beautifully, but these, near the church, barely shine on the pavement a meter around them. It feels like they're shrouded in a fog that isn't there. In addition, now and then you can hear strange noises in the neighborhood. Among the local boys there is a belief that if you stand for a long time on the threshold of the church, you can hear different things, shuffling steps inside, whispers, prayers of many voices, and also the echoes of someone walking and clawing at the dome of the roof. Did I check it? Of course I did, but usually standing for more than 5 to 10 minutes in silence was simply unbearable. Each check of the myth ended with one of us making a noise and us running off. Once, however, I did hear something. It was like a quiet, growing hum, not so much perceptible to the ear as palpable to the body. It didn't last long, and my ears slightly pricked up. I have an eerie, though probably understandable, memory of this chapel. Somehow, when I was a very dumb child, I saw this church move. The weather was very rainy, dank and slushy. I stood in a puddle in my rubber boots and watched the building across the street sway faintly from side to side. It seemed to me that a cross was about to fall from the dome, the asphalt next to it would crack, and some gravel would start to fall. The sight was unnatural and somehow disgusting. I remember it now, and it gives me a headache. It haunted me for a very long time and I still can't completely forget it. Every time I looked at the church, it seemed to me that the shape is not right, not symmetrical, curved. It was as if it was moving at that moment, but I couldn't see it. That's the way it is. I think these are all the events that I can relate to my personal experience. Although, something else may come to mind. However, I can briefly recount local legends and tales. Tales which originate from both my friends and the older folks around. People have lived there for generations and, regardless of age, love to talk about all sorts of creepiness and mysticism that lives literally next door to them. In such a place, ghost stories, of course, cannot pass you by. I will describe the most interesting of the legends relating specifically to ghosts and all sorts of spirits. First up is the ghost of a white guard, or aristocrat of sorts. He looks like a middle-aged man in old-fashioned clothes. He appears on the sidewalk near the cemetery at night every September 12th, looking at an expensive old watch on a chain. If you pass by, he asks you the time. If you ignore the question, the man will reappear a few meters away and ask the same thing. If you say you don't know the time, the man will shake his head, get upset and walk away. If you lie, then. There are different versions. Some say that the aristocrat will disappear at once, some say that he may stab you with a knife. If you tell the truth, the aristocrat checks his watch, says that he is in a terrible hurry and gives you the watch. It will disappear as soon as you put it somewhere in your pocket. However, if you stand there and look at the watch until sunrise, it will stay with you. What would a graveyard be without the ghost of a little dead girl? She can be seen at dusk, provided that there is a burnt smell in the air. You can also spot the ghost if you make a fire with a lot of smoke. If the smoke blows in one direction for a long time, you must go in that direction and then you will notice a translucent children's figure composed of smoke. This legend dates back to the 90s. Allegedly, the gang buried an important member of the organized crime group in the old cemetery, so they were going to honor his memory. Too much authority to lie in an ordinary cemetery. As a reminder, the cemetery itself has been closed to burials since the 70s. The bandits hastily and illegally prepared a discreet grave for their ringleader, and later were going to give someone the money to install a fancy, expensive monument. But it didn't work out and everyone forgot about Bratka. He lies in a small plot with a cheap cross with no name or dates. On winter nights, he was killed in winter. You can hear a hoarse voice calling,
"Boys? Where are you? Where? You dogs? Fucking A."
This is the spirit of a priest who served in the local chapel and died of old age at the age of 99 in there. I don't know if he actually lived there. He can be found on the eve of church holidays, and especially on the night before Christmas. He walks along the paths and crosses the graves of good people. The priest's ghost is a kind of spirit protector of our necropolis. Stepashka was an ordinary cat, one of the many stray cats that roamed around catching mice. The locals loved him and fed him. One day tragedy struck and Stepashka died under the wheels of a car. We dug his grave and buried it under a fence. Since then, many have told me that they saw Stepashka, that Stepashka was lying in the sun, sitting on a tree or just passing by. I hope that Stepashka is happy in the other world, and that he doesn't offend his descendants who still live in the old cemetery. On rare days, when a particularly thick and particularly milky fog descends on the cemetery, a soaring human silhouette can be seen floating amongst the crosses and monuments. It flies quickly, lightly, like a leaf in the blowing wind, and never stops. Sometimes it changes its elevation almost touching the ground, and sometimes it soars sharply into the sky, disappearing from view. It is impossible to make out the details of the figure. The silhouette always appears somewhere far away, at the very edge of the fog, and flashes for no longer than a couple of moments. It is said that its limbs do not move, its legs and arms hang limply and give the impression that it is a doll on a rope. All sorts of trivial beliefs are associated with this phenomenon, from the imminent death of the witness himself, to his relative and just random people. Sometimes there are rumors that a flying silhouette was seen before the death of some actor/politician/singer, as well as before a plane crash or accident and the like. A few years ago I had a conversation with my grandmother. We were just discussing a tragic event for our entire country. I don't think it matter which one exactly, and she mentioned,
"Oh, you know. We had such a fog here. Aunt Elle said she saw a man flying in the cemetery. Just the day before."
Next to the cemetery is a busy street with tram tracks. The Ghost Tram actually lives on them. It rides at night and differs from the ordinary trams in that it has no working lights. However, if a person is standing on the tracks, He is sure to warn of his presence with a loud trill. If you look closely, which is not easy in the dark, you can see that the tram is jammed with people. All the seats are occupied by black figures, and the driver's seat is empty. Well, I'm done with the classics in the form of ghosts. Now I'll tell you about the different hexes and curses. I'll skip the details about the naive vampires and demons and tell you about the most interesting ones. There are a couple of oaks in the cemetery, which, at the end of summer, abundantly shower their acorns on the surroundings. Also, there is a creature that supposedly loves to eat these acorns. It looks like something small, about the size of a large cat, black, hairy and extremely nimble. It runs under the trees and crunches acorns, shoving them into its mouth with knotted fingers. If it hears the slightest sound, it immediately leaves its silly business and runs off in an unknown direction. The creature is said to live in the burrows described in the posts above. Funny creature if you ask me. I would very much like to see something like that. Another little legend. It is said that people sometimes encounter, naturally at night, a huge dog, the size of a good bull. His fur is black and shaggy, and he reeks of aggressiveness. He stands far away with all four paws on the ground and watches you intently, ruffling his withers. However, he does not attack or even growl. It is as if he is guarding something. Sometimes he was seen running somewhere among the graves. Alas, I have never been able to find out anything specific about its exact location. One of my neighbor's story about a creature scared the crap out of me as a child. Every night before I went to bed, I begged my mother to close the curtains at night. All because he could peek through them, skinny, long and thin, gray and dried out. He was almost as tall as a house and lived somewhere in the cemetery, pretending to be a frail tree, such that you can't tell even if you stand close. And at night, he liked to come to people's houses and look through their windows. Why? God knows. Why shouldn't be the question. Just don't tell young children that someone might look through their window at night, because eventually they might really see someone there. It seems that when you walk around the necropolis you can see miniature lights that flutter easily between the crosses and the trees. It's like fireflies, which, unfortunately, are not found here. If you get close to the lights, they get scared and fly in different directions. One little girl assured me that she once witnessed this phenomenon. The lights were not flying randomly, but were attracted to each other and gathered into one big, bright red lantern. This thing flew several meters above the ground, and then slowly floated upwards and disappeared into the clouds. I was pondering upon the best way to name this legend. The words unknown, nameless, and other such names came to mind. But I'll be honest. Among ourselves, we simply called this thing the monster or the beast. It was this thing that was the central figure and the main character in our stories. He didn't live out there, but in a radioactive ravine that adjoined the cemetery. The radioactive ravine could be a story of its own. You can Google the Solovyov Ravine to locate it, found in Ulyanovsk. Incredibly creepy and unpleasant place. A huge multi-kilometer dump, overgrown with stunted trees and hiding in its depths the ruins of some houses. At the most daring suggestion, somewhere in the middle of this garbage dump is the entrance to the underground tunnels that stretch to who knows where. I find it hard to believe, though. Maybe I'll tell you more about this place next time, but now let's get back to the beast. The stories about it being seen by someone are few and far between, and they were all fiction. It was unpleasant to talk about it, as if it might cause trouble. The creature was a compilation of all the cryptic stuff that went on among the old tombs. Everywhere we could find traces of its activities. An oddly crooked cross? A huge tree branch broken? Torn wires? A broken lantern? Probably a rampage of drunken youth, or maybe not. Maybe it was the one wandering around. Did you hear a scary howl somewhere on a July night? We must be sure to tell our friends about it, and then discuss that it was it who came and was unsatisfied with something. What does this monster look like? There are many descriptions, but I see no point in listing them. I will say this, our monster looks exactly as you can imagine a creature wandering around a huge, old, overgrown cemetery at night to look like. The monster is the very essence of this place, a place that frightens and mesmerizes. The place where I grew up. I'm sorry I am beginning to ramble. I feel like it needed to be told. I think that's enough for now. A lot of energy and memories have been expended on these unsophisticated tales. Maybe I'll come back later and tell you a few more things. I'll tell more about the radioactive mini Chernobyl right next to the necropolis, talk more about the supposed tunnels under the cemetery, and maybe ask around regarding other urban legends in general. My tepid stories suggest that the necropolis is a creepy place where you can find some sort of hex or spook at every turn. But in reality, of course, that's not the case. It's just a beautiful park where you can walk among the old tombs, meditate on life and death, listen to the birds singing. If you ever decide to visit my city, be sure to check it out, as the cemetery is a 5-minute walk from the center. However, remember my main advice. If you find yourself there in the winter, remember, under no circumstances, don't eat the yellow snow.